So I wanted to expand and add in more of a discussion of Vikings and the pagan Germanic legacy. And this is still going to be very limited, but what I'm hoping is that this will actually kind of open up more ideas and things in which maybe you have not been familiar with, and in the future you can expand upon if you have further interest. So with the Vikings, there is so much interest and yet myth behind them. And what made that complicated was the fact that the Germanic people essentially did not have writing. They had runic inscriptions that they used, but they were usually, the runes were more or less messages. They were used for spiritual, cryptic religious purposes, sometimes for putting your name, but not huge bodies of work and so forth. And so the Vikings end up being written about solely through the eyes of the people who they attacked and invaded. And so obviously everything written about them for a very long time was extremely negative, right? Understandably. The word Viking, there's different debates about the meaning, but they were essentially raiders. They were kind of pirate-like characters that made a living pillaging off of people. And so obviously they're going to have some negative press, especially when it's coming from the people that they're doing that to. But imagine this, and I think this is a good illustration. 9/11 happened, and so we have a terrorist attack, right? Imagine if hundreds of years later there were writings about Al-Qaeda or Muslim terrorists only from the United States, and that Muslims didn't have a chance, or should I be much more specific, terrorist groups even, their voice was never heard. Now, I'm not saying that they should be per se. I realize I'm getting into a kind of controversial illustration. What I'm saying, though, is that George Bush said the terrorists attacked us at 9/11 because they don't like freedom. Now, the terrorists said that they attacked us, if you read their writings, on 9/11 because they don't like basically what we've been doing in the Middle East. Now, that's, again, I'm not trying to make sympathy there. What I'm trying to point out is that if we only heard the narrative from Bush, it just would not be a complete historic narrative. Do you get what I'm saying? Okay. Different groups, even if they do things that are terrible, have their reasons. Rarely, we see individuals act psychotically. They hear voices in their head or so forth. But when there's political/religious types of movements or whatever, things where a lot of people are organized to come together, they have their own vision and their own story to tell, for better or for worse. Okay. Now, the other thing I wanted to say, this picture has a certain problem in that these winged helmets probably did not exist on the Vikings, and there's never been a find for a horned helmet for Vikings, despite the fact that even in Scandinavia now, Vikings, you'll see pictures depicting them with horns. The Minnesota Vikings football team has horns. The horns put as a symbol for helmets of Vikings came in the 19th century for a prop for a play in Germany. So just to give you an idea, it's wild how something in popular culture can create an image that we have that so distinctly says Viking, helmet with horns, and no such helmet with horns was ever found in any archaeological finds or anything. Okay, so I'll let you know. All right. Now, before I go a little further, it was something talked about, if you watch a documentary or you read on Charlemagne, considered one of the real like modern founders of Western Europe, still celebrated in many ways. He was essentially like ISIS is now in al-Baghdadi, the Islamic ruler of the Islamic State, where churches are being destroyed and all these other kind of ancient artifacts, and people are being slaughtered if they don't follow the ways that they're perceiving it. This is what Charlemagne did to the pagans. Okay, so there's this famous massacre called the Massacre at Verdun, and I got this from Wikipedia, but I've read on this before. I just kind of cut and pasted to kind of give you a quick rundown. Basically, this is 782. About 4,500 captive Saxons, those are from Germany, okay, that were pagan. They rebelled against him. They didn't want to become Christianized. And so he chopped their heads off, and he even chopped down their sacred trees, okay, that were dedicated to pagan gods. And so this was a very infamous event. So think about this. This is during the time, I'm going to point out that the Vikings come shortly after this. So for all of the talk about the violence of the Vikings, we have to keep in mind that Germanic pagan people who were basically of the same kind of cultural background of the Vikings were facing ethnic cleansing and massacres and genocide by Charlemagne. And this, by the way, just to quickly note, the Nazis commemorated this event later on in the 1930s. Just something to kind of think about. Anyhow, I'm going to move on. So that Viking raid was, that massacre was about a decade before the first Viking raid. And I've talked about this in some of my other lectures, that many other historians have said, there's been all these various theories about why the Vikings started raiding. And some that debated, was it the fact that there were or lack of resources in Scandinavia, and men wanted to start going out to find more goods. There's all these various theories. And if you watch the Vikings TV show, which is a great show, by the way, it's very entertaining, but it's really sad how they don't incorporate a lot of history and scholarship into it on certain levels that they could have. They make it as if the Vikings never knew that they could ever go west, and they never heard of a Christian. They were, who are these Christians? Well, Saxony was not far from Scandinavia, and in fact, some leaders of Saxony, the ones that were massacred, I just talked about by Charlemagne, escaped up into the area of Denmark and so forth, the area in which the Vikings would come from. Most likely, they heard that Christians were slaughtering worshippers of Thor and Odin. And so I think that there was most likely several things going on. One, there was a group of people who wanted to pillage and sack and take goods, and also were angered and outraged at Christian atrocities to pagans, and then decided to do a little revenge in kind, and that may have sparked it off. But we don't know for sure. Okay, let's just be really clear on that. What is clear is that the Vikings coming out of Scandinavia, that is, by the way, let me clarify, what is now Sweden, Norway, and Denmark were all one people at one time, relatively. That's what we call the Norse, okay? And now their languages have kind of split into their own separate languages, but at one time they were interchangeable, okay? So Sweden, Norway, Denmark. And so these Vikings then started raiding the British Isles like crazy. And if you take a look at this timeline that I have here, you can see how they left their mark on Europe. And, they did this to the British Isles, but also into France. I'm going to show you a picture, a map here very soon. They just as the Anglo-Saxons, as I point out, were a Viking-like people, kind of similar culture. And the Beowulf poem, which I've talked about in other places, the oldest English poem sets puts the setting in Denmark and Sweden, and so the British Isles kind of has this series of various Germanic invasions after the Romans, right, in which the native Celts had to kind of suffer through or get through, and eventually the Vikings actually rule Britain. They leave a lot of influence on our culture today. The very word law comes from Viking rule, believe it or not. Okay, and so here's just a timeline. I don't have a chance to cover everything thoroughly. What I want to point out, though, is that when it says the Vikings reach Newfoundland, okay, they discover America. There's a story, the Vinland sagas, okay, but they don't do much with it. They basically get attacked by Native Americans there, and it just doesn't work out. But they have they wrote about it, this adventure. Now, as much as there is this bloody fight and battle between the Vikings and Christians, eventually the Vikings are going to succumb to becoming Christians themselves, just like all the other Germanic tribes. It's just going to be coming at a later period. I'm going to talk more about that. I'm going to go over, again, just a little bit more of the map, and then I'm going to cover the sagas, some of the literature that we get from them on the next lecture.